titled Coming Home. Some of you have asked me in the past how I come up with ideas, and generally speaking, I don't know that I have a really good answer for that. They just kind of come to me. Maybe it's the Spirit. In this particular case, I will tell you that in light of our celebration of Millie's life, who is now home, I thought I would address the church about joining Millie someday in our coming home. And it's taken from the Old Testament book of Ruth, chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. When Naomi saw that Ruth had her heart set on going with her, she gave in. And so the two of them traveled on together back to Bethlehem, which was home. So this picture, it's a small house. It's simple. It's adequate. It's one large room on a dusty street. Its tiled roof was one of many in what amounts to a very, very poor neighborhood on the outskirts of a Brazilian village. But it was a comfortable home. Maria and her daughter Christina had done what they could to add color to the gray walls and add some warmth to the hard dirt floor, maybe an old calendar here and a faded photograph of a relative over there. A wooden crucifix was there in the house as well. The furnishings are modest too. There's a pallet on the other side of the room, a wash basin, and a wood-burning stove. A very simple home. Maria's husband had died when Christina was just a baby. And so now the young mother, stubbornly refusing opportunities to remarry, she got a job and set out to raise her young daughter by herself. And now, 15 years later, the worst years were over, or at least so Mom thought. Though Maria's salary as a maid afforded few luxuries, at least it was a reliable job with consistent pay, and it paid well enough so that Maria could provide for food and for clothing for her and Christina. And now Christina, at age 16, was old enough to get a job so that she could help out too. Now, some had said that Christina got her independence from her mother, but she really bristled at the traditional idea of marrying young, like her mother did, and raising a family. Now, given the picture, not that she couldn't have had her pick of anybody in terms of a husband. Her olive brown skin, her big brown eyes kept a steady stream of potential suitors coming to her door. And she had this really infectious way of throwing her head back and just filling the room with laughter. She also had that rare magic that some women have that makes every man feel like he's a king just by being in her presence. But it was her really high-spirited curiosity that made her keep all of the men at arm's length, at least for a time, because Christina had spoken often of going to the big city. She dreamed of trading in her dusty, grimy neighborhood for the exciting avenues and bright lights of city life. Of course, that particular thought absolutely horrified her mother, because Maria was always quick to remind Christina of the harshness and the brutality of big city streets. She would say, "People don't know you there. Jobs are scarce and life is cruel. And besides, if you went there, what would you do for a living?" Maria knew exactly what Christina would do, or worse yet, would probably have to do for a living. That's why her heart absolutely broke when she awoke one morning to find her daughter's empty bed. Maria knew in an instant where her daughter had gone. She also knew what she had to do to go about finding Christina. So Maria quickly threw together some clothes and a bag, gathered up all of the money that she could find, and she ran out of the house. And on her way to the bus stop, she entered a drugstore to get one last thing. And that last thing was photographs, pictures. Maria sat in the photograph booth. She closed the curtain and spent all she could on pictures of herself. Then, with her purse full of these little small black and white photos, she boarded the next bus to the big city, which in this case happened to be Rio de Janeiro. Now, Maria knew that Christina had no way of earning money. She also knew that her daughter was too stubborn to give up on her dreams of big city life. Maria knew that when pride meets hunger, a human will do things that, well, were unthinkable before. Knowing this, Maria began her search. She went to bars. She went to hotels. She went to nightclubs. She went to any place that had a reputation for entertaining streetwalkers. She went to every last one of those locations. And at each place, she left a picture. Pictures were taped on the bathroom mirror or tacked onto the hotel bulletin board or even fastened to maybe the corner of a phone booth. And on the back of each photograph, Maria wrote a note. It wasn't too long, unfortunately, before money and photographs ran out, and Maria had to go home. She never found Christina. She was weary, she was heartsick, and she put her head in her hands and quietly wept as the bus made its long journey back from Rio de Janeiro to the small village from which she had come. Meanwhile, it was only a few weeks later that young Christina descended a hotel stairway. Her face, which was once so full of life, was just now tired and lifeless. Her brown eyes no longer danced with youth, but spoke of pain and fear. Her laughter, which once filled a room, was broken and empty. You see, her dream of big city life had become her absolute worst nightmare. And her heart ached 1,000 times over to trade those countless beds for that secure little pallet that she had on the floor of her home in the village. Yet her village was, for her in so many ways, all but a distant memory. And as Christina was descending the stairs and got to the bottom, her eyes noticed what appeared to be a very familiar face. She looked again, and there, on the lobby mirror, was a small black and white picture of her mother. Christina's eyes began to burn, and her throat tightened as she walked across and removed the small photo. And written on the back of the picture was Mom's note. Whatever you have done, whatever you have become, it doesn't matter. Please, Christina, come home. And Christina did. And as we talked at the beginning of this message, this passage from Ruth, the story of Ruth is really about many things. But at its core, if you read the entire book, it's the story of a believer eventually coming home. Naomi has been a long, long way from home, but even farther, unfortunately, from God. Now we find Naomi coming home, coming back to God. In fact, you can almost hear Naomi saying something like, "Wow, that was a huge waste of time. I followed my husband and my 2 sons out into the desert on this wild goose chase. And look where it's gotten me. My husband and my sons are dead, and I'm all alone." Terrific. But then, like a shaft of light coming through maybe a cloud-strewn day, she thinks, I can go home. There's certainly nothing keeping me here anymore. The promises of food, the promises of success, well, they just vaporized, just like my joy. And the dream of a life that I thought I was going to have with my husband and with my boys who loved me, well, it's died with them. Now I'm alone. But despite the fact that I'm alone, I can still go home. And she thinks, yeah, I'll just turn around and I'll go home. Lord, I'm coming home. And in Naomi, we see a pretty stark example of failure. We see her bitter experiences of being far away from God, but we also see a wonderful example of forgiveness. We see in Naomi the blessings that all of us can experience when we set our hearts for home. Now, 10 years have passed since Naomi had left Bethlehem, Judah, with her husband and her 2 sons. And you can find that in Ruth chapter 1, verse 4. Now, a decade later, her husband is dead. Her 2 sons are dead. One of her daughters-in-laws has abandoned her, and she only has Ruth joining her. But now, 10 years later, she decides to come back home. But it's a bittersweet homecoming for her. The home and the family that she had in Bethlehem are all but a distant memory. And she ponders her return back to a place where now she has nowhere to live, no place to work, and no one to come home to. Oh, she has Ruth, of course, but it's still not the same. I mean, it's kind of like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Naomi knows that there's no place like home. But remember, in The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy made that standpoint when it became clear to her and her dog Toto that they were no longer in Kansas any longer. So Naomi turns her face for Bethlehem, home. And let's face it, Naomi had made a really, really poor decision when she left Bethlehem. And maybe it was because she had to, because that's what her husband decided to do, Elimelech and her 2 boys. But nonetheless, she followed. But, she wasn't stuck. Instead, Naomi used her experience and her bad decisions as a prompt to now make a good decision, to go back to Bethlehem and to go back to the God that she once knew. Bethlehem was in the place of Judah, and Judah means praise, quite literally. And Bethlehem was a place where God was being glorified and God was being honored. It was a place where God was praised and God was exalted. Naomi was returning to that place where God's presence was very, very real. Moab, which she was returning from, she remembered had beckoned with promise a long time ago, but it proved nothing more than a mirage when she actually arrived. Bethlehem, on the other place, where God's presence was just palpable. You could feel it. Not that the famine which drove Naomi away from God in the first place did anything to make her feel God in a more personal way, but now, in the desert, God's absence for her was just overwhelming. It was a darkness, kind of a darkness so thick you feel like you could cut it with a knife. This really suffocating kind of darkness, a darkness that with little light could be dispelled. Naomi had to get back to that place where she could be in God's presence once again and experience firsthand God's loving kindness. And church, when we're away from God, our lives are barren of God's blessings. It's like that Mother Goose nursery rhyme, Old Mother Hubbard. Do you remember that nursery rhyme? She had a ton of cupboards, but what? All of them are empty. She didn't even have a bone for her dog. In other words, our little vacation away from God is not the tourist destination it was cracked up to be. It's barren, it's empty, and it's alone. But it's kind of hard to come home, isn't it? Well, no, the coming home part is easy enough. But what will happen to me when I return? Worse yet, how angry is God going to be at me for leaving when he sees me? It's just like, the teenager who stays out past curfew, breaks all the rules, thumbs their nose at authority, and then it occurs to them, now Dad is really going to be angry with me. But church, Satan has that argument down pat. He uses it all the time. For instance, oh, Randy, you're such a loser. You had your chance, and you've really screwed it up this time, and you'll never see God work in your life ever again. Or maybe it's the one, you only get one chance in life at this, boy, and you blew it. But church, Satan is a liar. He is the father of lies. That's what Luke writes for us in Luke chapter 8, verse 44. So if Satan is the father of lies, why would you believe that? That would be like you believing that I had oceanfront property to sell you in El Centro. The truth is that when we come home, we will find a forgiving God that will make himself known in our lives. He wants to be known. And if God wants to be known in our lives, why would he turn you away? Naomi knew that Bethlehem was a place of God's people. It was a place of kindred spirits and like-minded souls. In fact, you can probably think of someone who used to be at maybe this church, and their seat was never empty. Maybe it was not just a person. Maybe it was a family. It's like they owned the whole pew. But now, that same person, or maybe that family, is not only out of fellowship with God, but out of the fellowship of God. I want you to prove it to yourself. Think about it. Just look around you. Or maybe next Sunday. Look around and see if you can't spot an empty pew that was once filled by Mr. or Miss Dependable. I think you probably can. And when Naomi got home, the people knew her, but they were shocked to see her. Remember, a decade has passed since they last saw Naomi. And they said in Ruth chapter 1, verse 9, "Is this our Naomi?" And then I want you to notice her answer. Naomi, continuing on in verse 9, says, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara," which means bitter. Don't call me Naomi. You need to call me Miss Bitter now. So Naomi 10 years ago goes from Mrs. Pleasant to Miss Mara, or Miss Bitter. And in a word, one word, Naomi testifies to her family, to others who loved her, and now to us who can read about her story. She testifies to the results and the consequences of leaving God. It can leave you really, really bitter. And isn't it interesting that Naomi comes home, as you'll read in verse 22, she comes home in the springtime. Now, maybe that was just a coincidence. It was the time of the barley harvest, which is about the same time as Passover, a time of first fruits, a time of starting over, a time of forgiveness, a time when new life comes into bloom. And church, it can be springtime for you and for others that you love who may not be with us, who have wandered away from God. They can come home, and you can encourage them to do that. Because I think you've seen the picture, haven't you? You know, the colored photos of God that you see plastered everywhere you look. And you've even read your Father's message on the back of those photos, right? The one that says, whatever you've done, whatever you've become, it doesn't matter. Please, please, child, come home. There was a Chinese philosopher, his name was Lao Tzu, who said, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So, not necessarily for you who are here, but maybe for those you know, go ahead. Turn your heart back toward home. Take that first step, because we know that God still has your picture on his fridge. And speaking of refrigerators, ours went out yesterday. Apparently it was a slow death. It started, our refrigerator has like 2 doors that you open up, which is the refrigerated section, and down below is the freezer that you pull out. And we've been having some difficulty with the freezer. The light wasn't working. Seemed like things were, freezing and then thawing and then freezing and thawing. And we thought, okay, well, we'll bring out the repairman. And the first time we could get a repairman out was this coming Wednesday. Well, the slow death became a bit more rapid when we opened up the upper section, and now it's feeling actually a little on the warm side. So we had a little visit to Lowe's yesterday, and we got ourselves a new refrigerator. But I can tell you that in putting in the new refrigerator, which was delivered this morning, Sandy stayed home so that she could receive it. She put the pictures back up on the refrigerator. She put the magnets back up. You know, the stuff that decorates almost everybody's refrigerator. And don't think for a moment God doesn't have the type of refrigerator that's got your picture on it too. He loves you. He gave his son as an atoning sacrifice for you. He loved you so much that he sent his only son to die for you. He wants you to come home. And again, I'm preaching to the choir. You're here. You haven't wandered away. But if you look around, you can probably think of people who used to worship here some time ago that, man, you thought they were dependable. You could put a brass plaque on the pew where they always sat. They were always in that place. Now, I mean, Fred never wandered, but Fred always sat, right, in that spot on that second pew. You could just count on it. And so we know that people have wandered away. My encouragement to you this week is be the beacon of hope to invite them back. Naomi was gone for a decade until it finally occurred to her that maybe she would be better off going home and facing the potential repercussions of doing that than staying in this arid desert without God, without family, without a hope. She'd rather be home, maybe suffer the consequences, but at least be with God's people, only to find out that they welcomed her back. It was only Naomi that had this bitterness because she had left, but now had come back. And as you read through the book of Ruth, you see how Naomi's heart becomes more softer as the chapters unfold. I mean, most of the book is then devoted to Ruth and then her relationship and what she was doing, but every so often, the book of Ruth has little passages about Naomi's advice to Ruth. And you can hear it. It's the mother-in-law in this case, or like a mom. Okay, Naomi, or okay, Ruth, this is what you can do. This is how we need to set this up. Let's go this direction. She's back involved. She's back in the game because she's finally back at home. So for people that you know aren't here, would you just pick up the phone and call them? Send them a text. Invite them to come back. Sometimes people are afraid of what we will think when they walk through the door. Oh, you've been away for 10 years. what have you been doing? And then we get, Mr. and Mrs. Judgment, and people are fearful that that's what's going to happen. I don't think that this particular church family would be that way, but that's people's fear. Let them know that they can come in for a very soft landing. We're just happy to have them here because God loves them, and we love God. So this week, be an encouragement to others. If you can, reach out. Phone, text, email, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. Reach out to somebody that you haven't seen in a while and invite them back because we miss them.